I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. On January 20th, coinciding with our national holiday that commemorates Martin Luther King's contributions to this country, Donald Trump will be sworn in as the 47th President of the United States for the second time. Events that evoke the subject of ethics. So with that in mind, we invited the New York Times ethicist columnist and New York University professor Kwame Anthony Appiah. His recent award of the prestigious 2024 Kluge Prize recognizes his vital work in bridging philosophical discourse on pressing public issues. At a time when AI, cultural identity, class mobility, freedom of speech, and migration dominate headlines, Professor Appiah's expertise in cosmopolitanism, which he defines as universality plus difference, offers crucial insights into how we might navigate our increasingly complex moral landscape. In this half-hour conversation, we'll explore how his foundational principle that we have obligations to others that are bigger than just sharing citizenship speaks directly to our current societal debates and the challenge of maintaining human dignity in an increasingly polarized world. Let's talk about this post-ethical society. Are we in one? We talk about the fact that we are not in a position of telling the truth anymore. We are not concerned about ethics in business anymore. Is this a post-ethical society that we're living in?
I don't know that we're post-ethical. I mean, first of all, there are a lot of very decent people left. We should remember that when we're focusing on the defections from ethics. We should remember that there are a lot of people living decent ethical lives, ordinary people, but also some famous people living decent lives. And I think that what's true is that it's possible now somehow to maintain a position of standing, let's put it that way, in the public world while being widely understood to be, for example, dishonest about the facts or disloyal to one's friends and so on. I mean, there are a lot of defections from what one would think of as good behavior, ideal behavior, that seem to be less penalized in terms of social esteem than they used to be. That's interesting. I mean, I think that, but I think the main thing to remember is that when somebody, we might as well talk about President Trump since he's about to be our president again. When many of the people who support President Trump don't actually think of him as especially dishonest.
Mm-hmm. Something we have to remind ourselves of.
Yes. I mean, so very often people in our, as you said, very polarized society, we tend to think that our disagreements with other people are about values. But a lot of our contemporary disagreements are in fact about the facts. Everybody would have worn masks throughout the pandemic if they had been certain that doing so would save lives. But lots of people didn't. And one of the main reasons they didn't was because they didn't trust the people who told them that the mask would save lives. So it's not that everybody agrees that the less deaths, the better. But there's no disagreement about the values there. It's just a disagreement about the facts. And one thing about someone like President Trump is he's able to persuade people of factual claims that the rest of us who read the New York Times and take notice when claims are checked and proved to be false, don't believe. But it's not that they don't care about the truth, I don't think. I mean, there is a kind of carelessness about the truth, which is a sort of everybody does that kind of thing, Well, and it is true. All of us shave a little bit here and there to make a better story. Mm-hmm. My mother used to annoy my father because whenever he was telling one of his many wonderful anecdotes, she would chip in from time to time and say, "Oh, darling, that isn't what happened." But the point of the story
didn't happen quite that way.
Didn't happen quite that way. But the point is, the point of the story didn't disappear because my father was making it more interesting by adding something in or taking something out. So I think, one shouldn't be over moralizing about this. People are always shaving the truth and also simplifying. Right? Reality is very complicated, and if you're trying to argue for a position, say in politics, you can't fill in all the details. So you focus on the things that you think matter. You simplify. That's not dishonest. Everybody knows that that's what you're going to do. What's dishonest is deliberately trying to get people to have a misleading picture of the world. And I don't think that that's something that anybody approves of very much. So in that sense, I don't think we're all that post-ethical. There's a lot of bad people, but there've always been a lot of bad people. I watched Gladiator 2 the other day and was reminded that the Emperor Caracalla was in the habit of doing terrible things to people when he was in charge with his brother. And so we've always had bad people. I think what there is now is a world in which, and this is something where I think the so-called mainstream media is incredibly important. We're living in a world in which we can't govern the republic successfully together in a kind of spirit of comity because we can't agree on what's going on, right? So half the world thinks that there's not much change in the climate caused by humans, and half the world thinks that all our problems and the current fires in California and so on are connected with human-produced climate change. If we can't get together on things like that, we can't, of course, decide what to do about it. If our behavior has nothing to do with the changes in the climate, there's no point in changing our behavior in order to improve the climate. And if masks don't stop the spread of COVID, there's no point in wearing masks, and so on. The other thing, of course, that people disagree about in relation to COVID is vaccination. And again, there's now a lot more vaccine skepticism. President Trump is about to put in charge of our health a man who doesn't believe in a lot of vaccines. I think that's a bad thing because I think there's overwhelming evidence that most of the vaccines that the states now urge people to use are incredibly effective. Measles is on the rise now because people have been persuaded that the measles vaccine is a bad thing. But before the measles vaccine, thousands of children a year died from measles.
Well, Pat Moynihan famously said people are entitled to their own opinions, but not their own facts. Aren't facts facts? I mean, how do you get people to believe that certain things are true, or aren't they anymore?
Well, facts are facts. Let's hold on to that thought. But it's one of the messages, I think, of the philosophical tradition, the long philosophical tradition, both in Europe and its descendants' cultures and in East Asia, that knowledge is hard. So the facts may be facts, but finding them can be difficult. And the main way most of us find most of the facts we know is because somebody we trust tells us. So in a way, the real challenge I think at the moment it's not that people wouldn't want to know the facts if they knew they were facts, it's that they don't know whom to trust. Or worse, they're trusting the wrong people. I mean, the internet is full, and social media are full of people who make claims with a complete indifference to whether they've checked them. And people are constantly forwarding and making viral messages which they like, but which they have no reason to believe are true because they haven't investigated them.
Or they believe are true, but still aren't.
Yes. So I think there's a lot of sources, there's a nice body of work on how untruths spread on the internet.
So how do we build trust anymore? How does the press build trust?
Good.
How does anyone build trust so that when they say something factual, people will believe it?
Trust is a sort of human default. Language only works because if somebody says, there's a tiger coming, You don't ask yourself the question, well, do I have any reason to believe that? You just prepare for tigers. So the default is trust. But one thing that's happened, I think, is that a lot of institutions that historically were taken to be roughly trustworthy have come to be seen as untrustworthy, in part because they have betrayed our trust. I mean, the CDC made mistakes in explaining things, especially early in the pandemic. They expressed certainty about things that were uncertain. They also tried to discourage us from using masks because they needed the masks there were for medical people. That was a perfectly good thought. Mm-hmm. But that's what they should have said. They should have said, yes, masks will help you, but no, it's more important that the masks go to nurses and doctors and medical people at the moment until we've got an adequate supply. So it's very important nowadays, especially in an age when the web will circulate any little mistake you make, to be not to make claims unless you're confident of them, and not to make claims because you want people to do things, but because they're true, because you think they're true.
How much is the press responsible for the lack of trust in the press by becoming more analytical, less simply presenting the facts as they may be?
Well, there's two things going on, right? One is that people have more sources than the mainstream media, and many of those sources set out deliberately to build distrust in the mainstream media because they want people to believe what they want them to believe, and the mainstream media, which is going to check the facts, may or may not agree with them and may say so. So that's one problem. I do think that it helps to distinguish as much as you can between, as it were, news and opinion. And it is true that look, journalism has always been opinionated. If you report the Battle of Waterloo, you can't do so in a way that doesn't indicate whether you think it was a good thing or a bad thing that the French lost, right? And in the French newspapers it was reported one way, and in the British newspapers it was reported another way. I hope that to the extent possible both of them correctly said who won. I hope that they both correctly reported what they knew about how many people died and so on. But still, the tone of it was going to be different depending on whose side you were on. That's always going to be true. Indeed, it would be wrong to write about a battle in a way that displayed indifference to the question of whether it mattered who won. I think that would be misleading. But I think there's an awful lot of opinionizing now in places where there used to be less of it. And because once we're divided, people are going to stop believing the people whose opinions they don't like, even when they're telling the truth. So I think it is important for mainstream media to think about how to build trust. That includes admitting when you've made mistakes, explaining how you made them. It includes trying not to make mistakes and doing your fact-checking. It includes, I think, having at the next level up discussions as to how journalism works. A lot of people have no idea. I'm married to an editor, so I know about fact-checking. But a lot of people have no idea that people are astonished, for example, when I tell them that when I make a claim in my ethicist column in the Sunday magazine, somebody calls an expert and says, is he right? Right? I make a claim about the law or about medicine or something. Either I or I mean, sometimes it's me, and I send on the connection to the fact checkers. Somebody has to say, during the pandemic, there were a lot of questions about viruses and masks and so on. I have good medical friends, people who are distinguished professors at Columbia and Harvard and places like that in the medical schools. I can ask them. And then the fact checkers don't just take it from me, they call those experts. I don't think people know how much of this goes on in sort of the mainstream media in places like the New York Times, Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, LA Times, New Yorker.
And nonetheless, we sometimes still make mistakes.
Of course. I mean, this is the
Because
point.
we're human.
Knowledge is difficult. The world is complicated. Our systems for acquiring knowledge are not perfect. I mean, another place where I think we could do more to build trust is by doing a better job of explaining how science works. People are inclined to think that because scientists change their mind, you shouldn't believe them. But the reason we should believe them is because they do change their minds when they discover new information. And scientists are imperfect too, and people hold on to theories longer than they should and all that. That's all part of what you need to know. It remains the case that if you want to know where the next earthquake is going to come in California, it would be better to ask a seismologist than an astrologer. And why that is, you know, is I think, by the way, the seismologist may very well say, which the astrologer won't, I have no idea. I was once giving a talk at the Council on Foreign Relations, and somebody asked me a question, and I said, I don't know. And the president of the Council on Foreign Relations says, oh, we never say that here. Well, they should.
They should.
We should say we don't know when we don't know. And that builds trust. I mean, saying, look, I don't know.
People rarely say that, especially if they're deemed to be experts.
Yes. And so experts don't do a good job of communicating what they know about how expertise works. And we could do more of that. But look, in the end, at the moment, I don't think we're going to be able to come together on a picture of the world until we've come together in other ways first. We're a polarized society in part because we live in what a philosopher would call epistemic bubbles, not bubbles of information and knowledge. I live in the academy, I live at a university, and it's true about the academy that, especially in the humanities, there aren't a lot of Republicans.
Why is that?
That's a very good question. I think part of it is because once, I mean, there used to be, right? It used to be the case that, that Harvard professors were, some of them were Republicans and some of them were Democrats, and it's still the case. But the Republicans are famous because they're Harvard professors who are Republicans. It's a good sort of sociology of knowledge question. I think one thing is that to be recruited as a conservative into the world of the academy, you'd have to be comfortable with being surrounded by people whose main impulses are kind of critical of the way things are. The more I think the more deeply you think about society, the more you can see problems. And the interesting literature tends to be about the difficulties of life. Dostoevsky's more interesting than a romance novel because Dostoevsky makes us think about the hard and difficult things. And of course, there have always been conservative intellectuals who love literature and taught literature, but the current climate is sort of, in those domains, is a climate of kind of skepticism, which I think is natural in intellectuals. And part of the point of a certain kind of conservatism, I think the most serious kind of conservatism, is the recognition that what works in society depends upon a very complicated and subtle set of relations, and that if you disrupt them too much, things stop working. This was the Burke's point, Edmund Burke's point about the French Revolution, that if you, these people were all wanting to change everything, and he said, but they don't know what they're doing, right?
And they don't know what they want to change to.
Well, you mentioned Senator Moynihan. I mean, you know, he was very worried about changes in the 1960s that turned out to have profoundly disturbing effects on family life, especially among poor people. And they were well-intentioned, the changes, but he saw early on, because he had a sociologist's mind, that they might lead to bad things as well as good things. And I think that thought is I think it's the truth in Burkean conservatism, that society is complicated. I don't think that means you have to leave everything as it is because you don't know what you're doing. You have to investigate carefully and make, I think, small changes. The British Fabians, socialists, intellectuals of the early 20th century, called themselves Fabians after a Roman general called Fabius, who said it was better to do things slowly. And so they were contrasting themselves with the revolutionary socialists who wanted to change everything all at once. And the Fabians, who were the sort of intellectual foundation of the British Labour Party, said, no, we can do things better if we do them carefully and slowly and with lots of research. So they founded the London School of Economics to do the research.
One thing that, as a journalist and a very amateur historian, I've always had trouble coming to grips with is how much worse things are now than they've always been. We went through an American Revolution, a Civil War, a Red Scare, the Depression, and yet people say now we're more polarized than we've ever been. Is that true?
I don't think so. I mean, I'm old enough, as you are, to remember the late 60s. We were a very polarized, especially intergenerationally polarized society at that point. And at that point, I was in the young generation, not as I am now, an alter caca, as they say. But what's interesting about the current divides, though, is they are made different by the changing technology. It is easier now to live in a bubble of people who agree with you about everything than it was. When there were 3 television channels, major news channels, and they mostly agreed on what the top story was, you couldn't have these massively divergent views about what was going on in the world. Now there are thousands of sources, and it's a natural human temptation to pick the ones that say the things you already believe and that promote the things you already like. I said it's important for the mainstream media to build trust and to think about trust, but it's important for us as consumers, when we're using the web and so on, to think carefully about our own weaknesses and to do the things that you would do if you were worried about those weaknesses, which include paying attention to the views of the people you don't like and the views of the people you disagree with, and trying to figure out whether they might be right about something. One of the great privileges of my childhood was that when my grandmother grew older, she moved into a cottage next door to her bigger house, and she sold her house to a very right-wing member of the English Parliament. So our neighbor became this very right-wing person. And he was very nice. I mean, he had terrible politics, as far as I was concerned. You know, I was very, very left then, and my whole family were Labour Party people, and he was a staunch conservative. But he was a nice guy, and he was very nice to me. And I learned, therefore, as a teenager, that someone could be a very nice person, even a friend and a neighbor, and have horrible politics. And I think that that meant you could go on relating with them. You didn't give up on them because you discovered that, unlike you, they thought that capital punishment was a good thing or something. You went on. In my case, we went trout fishing. We continued to go trout fishing, even though we discovered that we had, from each of us, thought the other had terrible politics.
So where do you draw the line? Do you stay friends with someone if you're anti-Trump and they're pro-Trump? If they're anti-vaxxers, where do you say, I don't want anything to do with this person?
I don't think there's any reason to... if you build the relationships that work in human society, you can spend time with people who have almost any view. I mean, obviously, if somebody thinks that, I'm gay, if somebody thinks that gay people ought to be shot, it's probably not a good idea to spend too much time around them, especially if they have a gun. but one can spend rewarding time with people with whom one disagrees about all sorts of things. And in a way, I feel we have a kind of civic duty to do that.
Let me ask you a quick question. You've been writing the Ethicist column in the Times for almost 10 years. What have you learned from doing that?
The most surprising thing to me is how much of people's worries are about what they should say. I see a guy coming out of a restaurant with a woman, not his wife. They're relating in a way that suggests intimacy. Mm-hmm. I know his wife. Should I tell her? Do I have a duty to tell her? Am I free to tell her? Would it be wrong to intervene? I'm at the office, I see somebody doing something, I think they shouldn't be doing it. If I tell the boss, they may be fired. Should I speak? I mean, that kind of thing. And then there are just things about, what people call political correctness, which is not an expression I particularly favor, but where people say, well, can I say what I really think about something because people will think I'm reactionary or unhip. Now, people have always worried about what other people thought about them, and what you say affects what other people think about you. But I think the idea that we may have duties to pass stuff on, or we may have duties not to pass stuff on, is a very interesting idea. And I'm not saying that that's the vast majority of the questions are about that, but that was the most surprising area of ethical concern.
And you can get more ethical advice from the ethicist columnist in the New York Times, Professor Appiah of New York University. Thank you so much for joining us. And your insights are always illuminating and appreciated. That's it for this edition of the New York Times Close Up. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts. And don't forget to download the CUNY TV app. You can catch our weekly program on the go, anytime, anywhere.